That was not how he expected his day to go. Michael Carter sat in the courtroom, his hands resting on his lap, his face calm despite the murmurs rippling through the room. He had been in many tense situations before, but this was different. This was personal. The judge, an older man with graying hair and a stiff posture, barely glanced at Michael as he adjusted his glasses. His smirk was slight, but noticeable. The way he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk, made it clear. He had already made up his mind. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, his tone carrying an edge of amusement, "you do realize the severity of the charges against you." Michael did not flinch. His dark brown eyes remained steady, locked onto the judge. He had seen this kind of treatment before. Too many times. The way certain people in power assumed they already knew him, already judged him. The courtroom was filled with a mix of people, some watching with curiosity, others shaking their heads. A few whispered to each other, exchanging glances as if this was just another case, another black man being put in his place. The prosecutor smirked as well, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who thought the verdict was already sealed. "Your Honor, I believe it is quite clear that Mr. Carter—" Michael cleared his throat, cutting him off. The room went silent. The judge raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Something you would like to say, Mr. Carter?" Michael reached inside his suit jacket, moving slowly, deliberately. The bailiff tensed, ready to react. The judge let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as if this was all a joke to him. Then Michael pulled it out. The room fell completely still. Black leather wallet, crisp and official, flipped open between his fingers. The golden badge inside gleamed under the courtroom lights. United States Secret Service. The judge's smirk disappeared. His mouth hung slightly open, his eyes widening as he leaned in, as if he had to make sure he was really seeing what was in front of him. The prosecutor froze. The bailiff, who had been watching closely, suddenly took a step back. Michael exhaled slowly, his voice even. "Before we continue, Your Honor, I think it is important that you understand exactly who you are speaking to." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The judge did not speak right away. His eyes darted from the badge to Michael's face, then back to the badge. His fingers twitched slightly on the gavel, as if he was considering whether to slam it down just to regain control of the room. But the air had already shifted. Everyone felt it. The quiet in the courtroom was thick, the kind of silence that only happens when something truly unexpected unfolds before a crowd. The prosecutor, who had been so smug moments ago, swallowed hard. His eyes narrowed, as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. "What?" He cleared his throat and tried again. "What exactly is this supposed to mean, Mr. Carter?" Michael did not move. He let the weight of the moment settle, his badge still held up for everyone to see. The gold caught the light just enough to make sure there was no mistaking it. He wanted them to look. He wanted them to understand. "I believe it is self-explanatory," he said evenly, his voice calm but firm. The judge shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. His initial amusement had vanished, replaced by something else. Something closer to unease. He adjusted his glasses again, then set them down on the desk in front of him, rubbing his temple as if trying to buy time. Michael watched him closely. He had seen this reaction before. He had seen it in airports, in government buildings, in high-profile security meetings where people assumed he was in the wrong room. He had seen the way authority figures processed the moment they realized he was not just another face in the crowd. But this moment, this was something else entirely. The bailiff, a stocky man with a sharp gaze, shifted his stance. His hand hovered just near his belt, not quite reaching for his radio, but close enough that, Michael noticed, he could sense the questions running through the man's mind. Was this real? Was Michael telling the truth? Michael finally lowered his badge, slipping it back into his jacket in one smooth motion. "Now," He continued, his voice never wavering. "I assume we can proceed with the necessary level of respect and professionalism." The judge exhaled through his nose, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Mr. Carter," he said after a long pause, his voice no longer carrying that same dismissive tone. "Would you care to explain how exactly someone in your position found himself in this courtroom today?" Michael tilted his head slightly. He could feel the stares of everyone in the room, the way their curiosity had now morphed into something more intense. "That," he said, keeping his voice measured, "is a very good question." The courtroom, murmurs picked up again, a wave of hushed voices filling the space. Michael took a slow breath, knowing that this was just the beginning, because the truth was, he never should have been sitting in that defendant's chair to begin with. It had started just 2 days earlier. Michael had been in Washington, D.C., wrapping up a long week of work. The Secret Service demanded a level of alertness and discipline that never truly switched off. But he had managed to carve out a small window to grab coffee with an old friend, Detective Aaron Watts, a sharp-minded investigator he had known since college. They had met at a quiet cafe near the Capitol, a place tucked away from the usual rush. The conversation had started light, catching up, sharing work stories, but Michael had noticed the shift in Aaron's tone before his friend even said anything. "You ever feel like a case is pulling you somewhere you're not supposed to be?" Aaron had asked, stirring his coffee slowly. Michael raised an eyebrow. "You mean like when your gut tells you something's off?" Aaron nodded. "Yeah, exactly like that." Michael leaned back, watching his friend carefully. He had seen that look before. The kind of weariness that only came when an officer knew they were onto something big. "Tell me," Michael said. Aaron hesitated for a moment, then pulled out his phone. He scrolled through a few images before turning the screen toward Michael. This was taken last week, just outside the city. Michael looked. At first, it seemed like a standard crime scene photo. Yellow tape, a few scattered evidence markers. But then his eyes caught something in the background. A car. Black. Expensive. Government plates. He frowned. "Who does the vehicle belong to?" Aaron exhaled. "That's the thing. It was reported stolen. But when we ran the records, the ownership trail led somewhere strange." Michael glanced up. "How strange?" Aaron lowered his voice. "The kind of strange that makes people start looking over their shoulders." Michael did not respond right away. He took another look at the photo, feeling that familiar tension creeping in. He knew the weight of certain secrets. He had spent years in classified meetings, protecting people who moved in the highest circles of power. He knew how information could be buried, how the right hands could make records disappear. And now, just days later, here he was, standing in a courtroom, being treated like a common criminal. Coincidence? Not likely. Michael lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the judge. "Your Honor," he said slowly, "before we continue, I believe I am entitled to ask a few questions of my own." The judge stiffened. "This is highly irregular. And so is a federal agent being placed in this courtroom under circumstances that have yet to be properly explained." Michael interrupted, his tone sharp but controlled. A ripple of reaction passed through the spectators. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the judge as if seeking direction. Michael pressed on. "I would like to hear the official reason I was brought here today." The judge hesitated. For the first time since this hearing began, it was clear that he was not entirely sure what to say. Michael knew why. Because someone, somewhere, had pulled strings to put him here. And now, the question was, why? The prosecutor cleared his throat, stepping forward again. "Mr. Carter, while your credentials are unexpected, that does not change the fact that you were found at a crime scene under suspicious circumstances." Michael did not blink. "And what crime scene would that be?" The prosecutor hesitated, glancing down at his notes. A private property disturbance outside of Washington, D.C. A location that, according to our records, you had no legal authority to be near. Michael's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what they were referring to. Aaron's case. The stolen vehicle. The trail that was leading somewhere dangerous. Michael inhaled slowly, keeping his composure. So, let me get this straight, he said, his voice calm but firm. You are telling me that a highly trained federal agent who has undergone extensive background checks, security clearances, and years of service protecting this nation was arrested on the claim of suspicious presence near a case that, to my understanding, is still under investigation. The prosecutor hesitated. There were concerns. Michael let the words hang in the air. Concerns. He had heard that word before. It was what people said when they did not have a real reason. When they were looking for one. The judge rubbed his temple again, clearly trying to piece together what was happening. Mr. Carter, if you have nothing to hide, then I suggest we proceed in an orderly manner. Michael exhaled slowly. He could feel the room shifting again, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down. This was not just about a misunderstanding. This was something bigger, and he had every intention of finding out exactly who was behind it. Michael remained perfectly still, letting the tension thicken. In the room, the judge had tried to regain control, but the balance had already shifted. The weight of his badge had changed everything. The courtroom, once filled with quiet amusement at his expense, now held an entirely different energy. Suspicion, uncertainty, fear. The prosecutor cleared his throat again, flipping through his papers as if he was searching for something, anything, to reassert his authority. But Michael knew there was nothing in that stack of documents that could justify why he was sitting in that chair. This was not about the law. This was about power, and someone, somewhere, had decided that Michael Carter needed to be neutralized. He just needed to figure out why. I would like to request a recess, the prosecutor finally said, his voice steadier than before. He was buying time. Michael knew that move well. When things got too close to the truth, people in power always tried to pause the game long enough to reset the pieces. The judge hesitated. He was considering it. Michael could see it in his face. No, Michael said simply. The room turned back to him. The judge blinked. Excuse me? Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice controlled but firm. There is no need for a recess. If the prosecution has a legitimate case, they should be able to present it now. The prosecutor's lips tightened. Mr. Carter, this is a courtroom, not a federal briefing room. Then treat it like one, Michael said. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you are scrambling for an excuse. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, but Michael was not done. This entire proceeding is built on a vague accusation that I was somewhere I should not have been. But what you fail to explain is why I was there, in the first place. He paused, letting his words settle. Or why that scares you. The prosecutor clenched his jaw. No one is scared of you, Mr. Carter. Then prove it. The judge straightened in his chair. Enough. We will take a brief recess. Michael exhaled slowly, watching as the judge banged his gavel and stood up. The moment he was gone, the prosecutor turned on his heel and stormed toward the exit. Michael's eyes followed him. He had seen men like that before. Men who thought they could bury the truth under procedure. Not this time. Michael stood and adjusted his suit. As he turned, he noticed the bailiff watching him closely. There was something different in his expression now. Not just caution, but curiosity. A silent understanding that Michael was not just another defendant sitting in that chair. Michael nodded at him, then made his way toward the exit. He knew exactly who he needed to call. Outside the courthouse, the air was heavy with tension. The security guards watched him as he stepped onto the sidewalk, their hands resting near their belts. Michael ignored them and pulled out his phone, dialing a number from memory. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "I was wondering when you'd call." Michael exhaled. "You hear what happened?" "Only bits and pieces." "They moved. Fast. Someone is pulling strings." Michael looked up, scanning the street. He had spent his career spotting surveillance, and right now, he had the distinct feeling that someone was watching him. "I need to know who." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "You're not going to like the answer." Michael clenched his jaw. "Tell me anyway." "The car," his friend said. "The one Aaron was looking into? The real owner wasn't in the official records, but I did some digging. The trail leads back to someone high up." "How high?" "White House level high." Michael closed, his eyes briefly. This was worse than he thought. His friend continued. "And here's the part that should really worry you. Aaron has gone dark." Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean, dark?" "No calls. No emails. His department claims he is on leave, but no one knows where he is. One day he was at his desk. The next, gone." Michael felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Aaron would never just disappear. That was not how he operated. If he had gone silent, it was because someone made sure of it. And now, Michael was sitting in a courtroom on a bogus charge, being kept busy while the real story unfolded somewhere else. "Who is behind this?" he asked quietly. There was another pause. "That's the problem. Whoever it is, they are good. They wiped every trace of involvement. But I did find one thing." Michael waited. "The judge," his friend said. 2 weeks ago, he received a direct call from an unlisted government number. After that, his financial records show a sudden increase." Michael's stomach turned. "He was paid off." "Looks that way." Michael exhaled slowly. Pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was dangerous. This was bigger than just him. Bigger than Aaron. Someone at the highest levels of power had something to hide, and they were willing to silence anyone who got too close. And now, they had made a mistake. They had put Michael Carter in a courtroom and given him a reason to dig deeper. He ended the call and slid his phone back into his pocket. He had work to do.